Welcome, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Desert. I'm Julia Alberg-Burbank, your worship associate for today. As we begin, we acknowledge that we are on the historic homelands of the various bands of Cahuilla people. We honor the unique relationship that we hope emerges between our community and the indigenous people and their traditional territories. Let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder to recognize, honor, reconcile, and partner with the Cahuilla people whose lands and water we benefit from today. It's important to us here in this community that we create a safe and healthy environment for everyone who gathers in worship, including those who are immunocompromised or have other risk factors. Our COVID protocols about vaccination and mask use are in place because we wish to do everything we can to protect all of us. As a reminder that masks covering your mouth and your nose are required to attend in-person worship, preferably KN95 masks. If you arrived without one, we have some available at the welcome desk. Please choose to act for the health and safety of our community. Our service is always available, streamed on our website if you need to observe from home. Before we begin, we also want you to know that it doesn't matter where you or your ancestors are from, who you love, your gender identity, your theology, politics, or your immigration status. We welcome all those who are committed to our core values as expressed in our 8 principles. Together, we come to this place to share our hopes, dreams, and visions. We seek to build a diverse and inclusive community that honors our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every being. Thank you for being with us this morning. Please consider making a donation with our virtual offering basket. Your contribution is an important way to support UUCOD and today our Share the Plate Galilee Center. Those of you watching online can just click the link provided in our weekly Constant Contact order of worship you received on Friday, or at the end of the service today through the email link you will receive. If you're here in the room, we'll be taking up an offering later in the service, and you'll have an opportunity to give then. If you would like to be on our email list to learn more about us and our programming, please contact us at admin, ADMIN, at uucod.org. And now, we will ring our Tibetan bowl to begin our service and then listen to our music for centering.
Good morning. I am the Reverend Ian Riddell, and I have the honor and pleasure of serving this congregation as its minister. However you found us, however many times you've been here with us in person or online, welcome. Come. Come, whoever you are. Do you hear that voice calling you, calling us? That voice which calls us here today in this room, in this space, made holy by our presence and by the sacred breath we share in our singing, our speaking, our silence. That voice which calls us to remember that we are not alone and that we are inextricably linked to all other life, woven into a vast tapestry of existence of which we are a powerful, integral, and holy part. And just as we have been called together here today in this room, in this online space, we act as the voice, as the heart, as the hands of another call. The call to walk with the wanderers, to sing and dance with the worshipers, to proclaim the memory of those who have taken their leave, to wrap the despairing and the broken in the arms of love and community, and hold the hands of all of us who have broken our vows and call us back again and again to the covenant and the promise and the work of justice, humility, and steadfast faithfulness. For this we are here together today. So, my friends, come yet again. Come, let us worship together. And we're going to begin that worshiping together by singing together. I'm going to invite you to stay seated for this one. We're going to sing Come, Come, Whoever You Are. The words will be on the screen. We're going to sing it through 3 times through on our own, all together. And then what we're going to do is we're going to split the room, I think, right between Jane and Fran. So this side of the room will start, and then this side of the room will follow after. And we're going to sing it 3 times through in a round. Does that make sense? So 3 times through all together, 3 times through in 2 parts, and I'll make sure to bring you in each time. It goes like this. Ready? It goes, come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come. Let's try that. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come, and again. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come. How does that feel? Do you feel like you're ready to do it in 2 parts? Okay, so those of you on this side, Vanessa, sing strong. Lead, you guys follow. We'll start here. It's when it's come, come, whoever you are, come. Ready? Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come, and again. Come, come, whoever you are. Come, come, whoever you are. Wanderer, worshipper of despair. Come, yet again. One more time, extra strong. Come, come, whoever you are. Come, whoever of thee. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come. Come, yet again come. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Please join me in these words as Reverend Ian lights our chalice. May love be the spirit of this church. May the quest for truth be its sacrament and service be its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, and to help one another in fellowship, this is our aspiration. Please join me as Jane Zong comes forward to help light the BioPOC candle. We light these candles in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as they journey towards spiritual wholeness. May we, as a beloved community, work to dismantle racism and all forms of oppression. May we live out our principles so that justice, dignity, equity for all prevail.
I have a little story for us this morning. And this story comes from an old Yiddish song. The version I knew it best and earliest was from a picture book by Sims Tabak, but I've gotten a little crafty this morning. This is Joseph had a little overcoat. This is Joseph's overcoat. Joseph had a little overcoat which he wore all the time, and eventually it got old and worn out. Now, Joseph was a tailor, so he knew what he could do. He turned his coat into a jacket and went to the fair and wore it and wore it and wore it. Joseph had a little jacket, and it got old and worn, and so he put it away. Well, he didn't put it away. He worked on it, and he made a vest out of it. He made a vest out of it. And the vest eventually, because he wore it every day, got old and worn. So he worked and worked and worked and made a scarf out of it. The scarf he wore every day that it was cold and chilly, and even the evenings when it was cold and chilly. And it too got old and worn and a little musty. And so he took it to his workshop, and he worked and he worked and he worked. And he made a tie out of it. And the necktie he wore every time it was appropriate to wear a necktie. He didn't live in Southern California. He wore a necktie every day, and it got old and worn too, a little bit of soup on it. Perhaps the cat scratched it up a little bit. And so he thought to himself, what could he do? He took it to his workshop, and he made a little handkerchief out of it. He made a handkerchief out of it and used it at every meal and as he walked through the streets, and it too got old and worn. And so he thought to himself, what could he do? So he went to his workshop and he made a button out of it. And one day he lost the button, and now he had nothing. So he made a story about it, which goes to show you can always make something out of nothing if you have enough imagination. So I'm going to invite Vanessa and Joel to tell us a little bit about imagination.
Today, as part of our reflection, I'd just like to, introduce myself to you as the newest worship associate. Who am I? I'm Julia Alberg-Burbank. My husband, Tom, and I became members last year. I'm a mom to 4 and a nana to 1. Hi, Levon. And I've been teaching for 30 years, grades 3 through graduate school. Reverend Ian and I had a really wonderful conversation in which he asked me, why this? Why was I interested in this role? Which I thought was profound and important to reflect on. And so as we were getting familiar with UUCOD over the past couple of years, I would take classes to get to know others. We were at home in the pandemic, and it gave me, from the safety of my house, a chance to reach out and start to know people here in the congregation. And it also provided an opportunity to learn more about UU traditions and history. One such class I took, which I highly recommend when it is offered in the fall, is spiritual leadership. I was drawn to this class because I had just earned my doctorate in educational leadership, and I wanted to see those connections between leadership in a spiritual setting and what I know to be the necessary criteria for leading in a secular and educational setting. How would the spiritual aspects of Unitarian Universalism add dimensions to the concept of leadership? So throughout the class, Jane Zahn and LeGrand Velez and I would examine and discuss the topics of the course together and how they were reflected both in ourselves and in our congregation. The topics we delved into included centering one's gifts, doing our interior work, symbols and traditions, spiritual risk-taking, and covenanting. Due to the value that we as Unitarian Universalists place on democratic values, leadership belongs not just to the minister or the board, but rather to each of us. And we lead with one another for the betterment of the whole. We do this through contemplating our gifts and taking a spiritual risk as we share them to uphold our part of the covenant with one another. And I did find meaningful connections between my research and spiritual leadership. In the context of today's service and examining the questions, how will we be for each other? What does that look like? Sociology can provide a really useful framework through symbolic interactionism, which was the framework that I used in my research. This framework, as a way of examining relationships between people, comes from the late 1800s, is developed by John Dewey and passed along and refined by George Meade Simply put, symbolic interactionism holds that we use symbols to create relationships with one another and to provide context to our interactions based on the values we place on those symbols. When I think about our conscious choosing to build a beloved community by widening the circle, I think about the expansions of symbols to include more people within our congregation. Those symbols are visual representations of our actions, our interactions, and our values.
I want to, before I start my sermon, just share a great joy and appreciation for our AV folks who have just been so wonderful at caring for this congregation and spending the time to prepare us and get us ready. And when technical things go wrong, and technical things go very wrong all the time with all sorts of people, even people you pay hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to. And so I just want to say really much gratitude for our AV folks for their commitment to this work and for their, they may not feel it, but I experience it as unflappability. We'll just figure this out together. So gratitude for that, and gratitude for air conditioning. The air conditioning in that half of our building is not working right now, so thank you for spending your time in here this morning. We'll have that fixed. We're having that fixed tomorrow. So grateful for all of those who leapt to the need for that. So, like so many of you, I imagine I am feeling the world is a little more overwhelming these days than it has been in the past, perhaps. Things are feeling really rough and frightening right now, and they have for quite a while. Politics, the environment, the Supreme Court, gun violence, fires and heat waves, protests, counter-protests, and this constantly mutating pandemic. Our social media help us keep in touch and keep in the know, and they also bombard us with so much information and misinformation. It's hard to know what to pay attention to, what to ignore, what to pass on, what to dig deeper on. And I feel like I've stood here and said all of this to you a lot over the last year. It feels like where I've started all of my sermons for a long time, overwhelmed by the world. I'm wondering, what do you do when you are overwhelmed? When you wake up and the world is too much, what do you do? I mean, other than pull the blanket back over your head and go back to sleep. I hope that one of the things that we all do is turn to our communities of support and inspiration, turn to each other in the quiet of our homes or the jostling of the checkout line or the warmth of religious community, turn to each other to seek out answers and hope, to ask each other what to do. How do we respond? Who are we to be in times like this? J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for us to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time given us." Many of us are struggling, young and old, conservative, liberal, native users of social media, and the non-tech savvy, and those of us in between. Many of us are struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing world. The ways we learned to be as we grew up, the ways we have come to understand ourselves and our place in the world feel like they're under attack. And they feel inadequate to deal with the reality of the world around us and with our part in making and changing it. So often, we retreat from the reality that is demanding so much of us, retreat from the fear of losing ourselves that dealing with the world brings up in us. So what are we to do? How do we cope? How do we deal? Well, I know that I often retreat into entertainment, reading favorite books, watching movies and TV, listening to music. Now, you know by now I'm a nerd since birth, so the books and media I choose are almost always science fiction or fantasy. I started young with comic books and Wizard of Earthsea and The Lord of the Rings. These days it's usually comics still, or Star Trek, so much Star Trek, or a favorite sprawling series of novels, or Doctor Who. I want to talk to you a bit about Doctor Who today. I picked this color for a reason. A refresher for those of you who don't or haven't watched Doctor Who. For almost 60 years now, the show has presented stories of a time-traveling humanoid alien, a Time Lord with two hearts, who has the ability to regenerate when mortally wounded, thus allowing the show's creators to continue telling stories with new actors every few years. These days, for those of you not in the know, we are awaiting the final adventures of Doctor number 13, the very first female Doctor, and the arrival of Doctor number 14, who will be the first permanent Doctor of color, the black man. Now, I've spoken to you about Doctor Who before, I know, and today I want to look at one of the central themes or conceits of the show, this idea that the Doctor can regenerate when mortally wounded. Every few years, after a variety of adventures in time and space, traveling around in a this blue, police box, the Doctor, which is actually a time machine, the Doctor will suffer an injury or attack that is powerful enough that it looks like it will end their existence. And then, through the miracle of special effects, better and better over the years as technology improved, there is a flash of light or a burst of energy or some other odd or psychedelic event, and the Doctor is transformed. One actor replaces another. The elderly, dignified first Doctor is replaced by the off-center recorder-playing second Doctor. The frizzy-haired, scarf-wearing fourth Doctor is replaced by the blonde, dashing fifth. Each different, with different quirks and signature phrases. The 11th like to wear bow ties and a fez. And the 10th like to say, allons-y, which is let's go in French, by the way. There are, of course, similarities, though. The drive, the arrogance, the brilliance, the compassion. There are female Time Lords. We've met several in the past, and Time Lords with different ethnicities, but much to the chagrin of many viewers who would love a female doctor, or a Caribbean doctor, the fact is that until just recently, the Doctor was always, even after all these transformations, a white British guy. That has marvelously changed with the 13th and 14th Doctors, and it's very exciting. But after regeneration, the Doctor is still in some deep way the Doctor. There is something that continues despite the changes in looks and vocabulary, like there is something that stays the same when Joseph's coat becomes a vest and then becomes a button. Something central remains. But the way of being in the world has changed each time. You could say that Doctor Who is really at heart than a meditation on identity. With only a couple of exceptions, it seems, the Doctor's regenerations have not been willed changes. They've come about because of injury or attack, and the incarnation of the Doctor in question has little time to plan. They're usually driven by the desire of the current actor in the role to move on to other things. In fact, until recently, we didn't know that there could be any control over what the next incarnation would be. But the 8th Doctor, it seems, had some help in his regeneration. He was aided by a powerful sisterhood who offered him a choice as to what his next incarnation would be. So looking at the world around him and responding to the events of his own incarnation, he saw a universe at war with immortal races in mortal conflict. And so the 8th Doctor chose to be regenerated as a warrior. And more recently, we've seen the Doctor choose what his new regeneration will be to remind himself of a piece of his character he'd forgotten. The 12th Doctor was played by the actor Peter Capaldi. And Peter Capaldi had actually played a different character earlier in the series, a character that the Doctor had gone out of his way to save from the fires of Pompeii. I told you there was time travel. And so when the 11th Doctor regenerated into the 12th, he chose the face of this character to remind himself that his role was to save people. Because he'd realized he'd forgotten this, and that was what the world around him needed more than his own needs, someone who would save people. So the Doctor remained the Doctor, retained the permanent part of himself, and changed form at least twice to address the needs of the world. Now, from shape-shifting time travelers, I want to cast our minds back to the early days of our own religious tradition. During the early 19th century, our Unitarian forebears were attacked for abandoning the truth of Christianity. Because they questioned the divinity and eternal pre-existence of Jesus and valued the use of reason in religion, they were branded heretics. They were accused of not being, quote, real Christians at all. Many Unitarian clergy and thinkers responded to these attacks in their sermons and writings. And the Reverend Theodore Parker was prominent among them. Most famously, he preached a sermon in 1841 at the ordination to the ministry of Charles Shackford, which we've now come to call, get ready for it, the transient and the permanent in Christianity. I want to share a little bit of a reading from that sermon with the gendered language of the time. I haven't changed any of his language. Parker said, "In that proportion of Christianity which is preached and believed, there seem to have been, ever since the time of its earthly founder, two elements, the one transient, the other permanent. The one is the thought, the folly, the uncertain wisdom, the theological notions, the impiety of man. The other, the eternal truth of God. More is generally given to the transient in Christianity than the permanent therein. It must be confessed," he continues, "though with sorrow, that transient things form a great part of what is commonly taught as religion. An undue place has often been assigned to forms and doctrines, while too little stress has been laid on the divine life of the soul, love to God and love to man. Religious forms may be useful and beautiful. They are so whenever they speak to the soul and answer a want thereof. In our present state, some forms are perhaps necessary, but they are only the accident of Christianity, not its substance. They are the robe, not the angel, who may take another robe quite as becoming and useful." End of my quote from him. Parker was responding directly to the accusations that the Unitarians were not really Christians. For Parker, love of God and love of man and living one's life practicing those two was Christianity. All the rest, the ritual and the words and practice and dogma, all of it was transitory, created by humans and therefore mortal. The transitory could and should eventually pass away. What mattered was commitment to what was permanent. The message of Jesus: love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. All the rest, according to Parker, was passing, and to hold it as permanent was idolatry. So our tradition has changed since Parker's time. But just as in the Christianity of his day, there are things that are permanent in our tradition, and those things that change over time. The core of our tradition, I would say, are our permanent convictions, the values we hold most dearly. And what we are being called to change is how we live those out in the world. Who do we need to be for these times? How can we make choices for our regenerations? There are voices calling for change. We've been hearing them better in our congregation and in our denomination lately. This is one of the reasons for our work in widening the circle of welcome and belonging. In our work, adopting the eighth principle, in our work, figuring out together how we will live these values out in this day and age. The call for change is not new with the widening the circle idea or the eighth principle. It's not even new when I'm going to quote from now. In 2016, a book was published called Turning Point, Essays on a New Unitarian Universalism. And we can hear so many calls that are similar in this. The Reverend Cheryl Walker wrote, "I love the promise of this faith, but when I, as a person of color, look at us, I wonder, how can we say we affirm our principles and yet fail to accomplish the most simple yet difficult task, creating a community where everyone can come and be who they are? We love our individuality so much we cannot make room for someone else's. We are unwilling to give up even a piece of our individuality to create community where all truly feel welcome." End quote. The bottom line, as we're learning, is that we just may have to change. We may just have to let go of our fixed perceptions of who we are and who we have been in order to deal with the realities of our lives and the lives of those around us. We may need to let some of the transitory fall away so that we recognize the core of our convictions. So, what might be transitory in Unitarian Universalism? You might have some ideas for yourself. Here are a couple of mine. Control as a way we live in the world, the elevation of reason over everything, and that everything we think through reason is objective, this idea of objectivity. Perhaps the notion that the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, means that I can say anything I want and do anything I want, regardless of relationships. The centering of white American culture may be something that is transient. We may need to respond to the world with what it needs and not just with what we want it to be. We may need to free ourselves from the notion that who we have been is who we must be. In Turning Point, Reverend Tamara Leback wrote, "What are the uniforms of your culture that you don't even know you're wearing?" I invite you to spend the energy and the time learning how you came to be who you are. Define your values and your commitments, and then bring your whole self to the table. The more we are able to understand our assumptions and demonstrate the complexity of our own identities, the less we will be threatened by the differences of others, and the more accepting we all will be. Rather than an argument for individualism, this is a call for an in-depth study of our own culture as it manifests it. Our self-examination provides a foundation for building relationships that make more room for difference. End quote. Now, I do not think that we should abandon everything and let ourselves be blown about by the whims of the world. Our individual and collective conviction that love is the core of who we are and what we do should continue to shape our actions. It is not a stress for me to echo Theodore Parker's celebration of love of the holy and love of our neighbors as the permanent center of our religious commitment. But as Julia said earlier, finding our gifts, seeing the needs of our community, and deciding how to share them are holy tasks of leadership. We can choose to center the symbol of the beloved community rather than the symbol of the rugged individualist, and know that we will build different relationships, that will lead to different ways to live out our values. And we do not need to do this alone. We cannot do this alone. We build our lives in community, supported by those who love and who challenge us. And we build our lives inside a tradition that is committed to adapting the teachings of science, the results of philosophic exploration, and is grounded not in eternal truth, but in the reality of experience, ours and those we encounter. And each day, we awake regenerated with the possibility of greeting the world and choosing how we will live our lives and use what powers we have. When we encounter people in pain and confusion in our community, when we feel the loss of those we hold dear, when we see the world full of violence and hatred, what will our response be? Will we hide our eyes and turn back to the comforts of habit? Will we live in fear of losing who we think that we are? Will we make the transitory permanent? Or will we use our imagination, our pure imagination, and move into the day with curiosity and with hope, intentionally choosing to be what the world needs of us, grounded in the knowledge that love is central to our life in this world and ever ready to respond with loving kindness and compassion to the needs of the world around. May it be so.
Please join me in these words as Reverend Ian extinguishes the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Friends, I want to close with the words of my colleague, the Reverend Karen Herring. Can you feel it? The humming in this story, this time that calls to each of us now. Are you listening to the ancient rhythms resounding in the between? Old instructions for new arrangements beckoning us to ask, who are we becoming? In the chaos of great change, what imaginable possibilities are waiting to awaken in you, in me, in us, in the world? Are you willing to let go of what you know now to become something new? In the face of this becoming, my friends, go in peace, imagining new possibilities to love and serve the world. Go in peace.